Redistricting, or the drawing of voting maps, when done fairly, can ensure equal voting power and representation. First, let's clarify a couple key terms. The term redistricting refers to the redrawing of voting district boundaries, largely based on population. This process is necessary as the population in an area increases or decreases. On the other hand, gerrymandering is a term that refers to the intentional manipulation of voting maps during the redistricting process in order to create an advantage or disadvantage for a political party. This video will not cover the basics of redistricting and gerrymandering. Other videos on this subject are available at lwv-wake.org or on lwv-wake's YouTube channel. This video will provide tips and strategies for talking to others about redistricting reform. Keep in mind that you don't need much information in order to be an advocate for change when you talk to your friends and family about this issue. We will cover how to create simple messages, the use of figurative language, and simple persuasive approaches depending on a person's attitude toward redistricting reform. But first, I have some good news and some bad news as it relates to effective messaging and redistricting. First, the bad news. The redistricting process, and in particular, the process of gerrymandering, is complicated. It can feel like a tangled web of facts and technicalities. Most voters are not well informed on the issue. So, you can't assume that the average voter understands the redistricting process or gerrymandering. Even voters who favor redistricting reform may still have limited knowledge on the issue. However, because the issue has been in the news so much the last few years, I will say that more voters have at least heard about the issue than maybe 10 years ago. But voters who don't regularly follow state-level news really may not understand redistricting. Okay, so that's the bad news. But the good news is that simple messages are more persuasive. The research on messaging on redistricting consistently shows that simple messages are best. That's true with most political messaging. When explaining complex information, you want to keep the message as simple as you possibly can. So since the message needs to be simple anyway, you don't have to be an expert on the issue to talk to others about redistricting reform. In fact, you really need to stay out of the weeds when you talk to most people. Most people don't even want much information in order to form an opinion on this issue. Here's some general advice on talking about redistricting. Keep the message simple. That means staying out of the weeds. Avoid complex words or phrases. For example, refer to drawing voting maps rather than redistricting, or manipulating voting maps rather than gerrymandering. Avoid the technicalities of redistricting and gerrymandering. For example, you don't need to talk about cracking or packing. You don't need to refer to the compactness or the contiguousness of a district. You don't even need to fully understand these sorts of details yourself in order to talk to others. Focus instead on principles of nonpartisan redistricting in terms of fairness rather than specific ways of doing redistricting. And finally, use vivid language, including metaphors and analogies. Let's talk a little more about creating a simple message by linking to shared values, and then I'll talk more about using vivid language. The simplest messages are often grounded in basic beliefs and values. When talking about redistricting or gerrymandering, anchor your fundamental messages in core values and beliefs that you and others probably share. Most people value fairness, accountability, impartiality, honesty, and integrity. Messages that are about promoting democracy, notions of common sense, building trust, especially in government, protecting the right to vote, and the belief that government should be by, of, and for the people tend to be more compelling messages. So think about the values that may appeal to the person you're talking to. One way to create a simple message that can also say a lot about an issue is to use vivid language. Metaphors can create a mental image. They often serve as a shortcut for explaining complex information. Analogies can also explain complex information by comparing something unfamiliar to something that is more familiar to the person you're talking to. But you need to use examples that resonate with the person you're talking to. Some people may find metaphors related to the behavior of animals appealing, while others may relate better to sports analogies. Let me share a few examples of figurative messages with you. If you want to talk about how elected officials don't have to listen to constituents because they are in safe districts, you might say that it's as if politicians have on noise-canceling headphones. They just don't have to listen to the voters. If you want to describe how politicians manipulate voting maps, you might describe it as shifting voters around like pieces on a game board. If you want to describe how districts are drawn, you might say that politicians are drawing voting maps behind closed doors. We often hear politicians say that since their party is in power, then they have the right to redistrict any way they want. But that's like letting the winning basketball team select the referees they want for the next season. All of these examples help to describe gerrymandering and its implications. Politicians drawing their own voting maps to advantage themselves or their own party represents a clear conflict of interest. So let's look at several examples to describe this conflict of interest. You might describe it as being like having the fox guard the henhouse. The fox will be guided by its own needs as a predator with little concern for the farmer's interests, let alone the well-being of the chickens. Similarly, you could describe that conflict of interest as letting a bear guard the honey, or as letting bank robbers guard the bank, or like putting squirrels in charge of feeding the birds. And we know what the squirrels will do. The birds will likely go hungry. These last few examples address the notion of the conflict of interest inherent in gerrymandering. But they also link to our values of impartiality and fairness. You can also describe what needs to change as it relates to a more transparent redistricting process by using figurative language. For example, we want politicians to pull back the curtain and let us see the process. Or you might say that what we want is for politicians to open a window and let us see the process. Or you might say that what we need is to shine a light on what politicians are doing. These last three examples refer to the need for a transparent process, but they also appeal to our values of accountability and honesty. I've given you a number of examples of how to use vivid language that helps explain gerrymandering in very simple terms. You can probably come up with other creative examples. Just keep in mind that you want to try to use references that will appeal to the person that you're speaking to. I now want to talk a little bit about how to approach talking to people with different attitudes on the issue of redistricting. Whenever you're determining your persuasive approach, you need to try to assess the person's current position on the issue. Do they already agree with you? Are they undecided on the issue? or do they clearly oppose redistricting reform? Knowing a person's attitude will help you determine how to then approach the conversation. First, let's talk about what to do if they already agree with you. If they agree, is it even worth talking with them about redistricting reform? It's a little like preaching to the choir, right? But yes, you should talk to them about redistricting. You can strengthen their position by presenting new information that they may not already know. Keep in mind that they may already agree with you, but they may not be doing anything about the issue. So you have an opportunity to tell them how to engage in some advocacy to get redistricting reform. Take them from someone who supports ending gerrymandering to someone who will take action. So yes, it's worth the time to talk even to people who say that they already support redistricting reform. Let's talk briefly about how to approach talking to someone who is undecided. They may be undecided because they don't know anything about the issue. So this is an opportunity to teach them a little bit about redistricting, but keep it simple and stay out of the weeds. You might also explain why they should care. Appeal to their core values like fairness and politicians being transparent. Or ask them about the kinds of issues that they care about, but that they think politicians are not addressing adequately. Explain that politicians don't have to do anything on that issue if they've been drawn into a voting district where they're guaranteed to get reelected. If you're virtually guaranteed to get elected, you don't have to listen to what the voters care about. All right, now the hardest audience, those that disagree with you. When someone disagrees with you on the need for redistricting reform, you should first set reasonable goals. You may not convince them in just one conversation. The best you might do is prompt them to think about it more or reconsider their position. It's also important that any information you provide comes from sources that they would view as credible. I recommend sticking to nonpartisan sources of information on the issue of redistricting. Finally, try to find some common ground on the issue. For example, you might both agree that politicians should do things in a transparent manner. From that area of common ground, you can then talk about how the system is not transparent enough. Here's the good news about people's attitudes on redistricting. Polling shows that the majority of voters support fair redistricting. You will probably encounter people who are undecided just because they don't know much about the issue, and that's an opportunity to explain the basics. Now, you may encounter a few people who understand redistricting and are still opposed to ending gerrymandering. Keep in mind that many of those people are politicians or they somehow work with political parties, and they have something to lose by changing the process. The others who are not politicians may just need more information from credible sources and an explanation on how ending gerrymandering is consistent with their personal values. This video has provided some easy tips and strategies for creating simple messages, linking to common core values in the conversation, using figurative language as a simple shortcut for explaining a complicated issue, and provided a few strategies for how to approach the conversation depending on whether the person agrees, disagrees, or is undecided. If you'd like more information, including more examples of how to talk about redistricting reform to others, I encourage you to take a look at the League of Women Voters of Wake County's messaging guide at lwv-wake.org. As you learn about redistricting, you can be an influential advocate for change within your own circle of friends, family, and colleagues. Just remember that above all else, keep the message simple.